Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about storage and data. For those who like specifics, it's not actually everywhere, as it says on this slide. We have managed to restrict most of it to the surface of this planet. You might be interested to know, however, that over the next year it is on track to exceed the number of stars in the known universe. So what is the problem and what can you do about it? To take this back down to earth, we've got our regular Tony Locke. Morning, Tony. Who's, for those who don't know Tony that well, he actually is a trained astrophysicist. And also we have Ian Shea from IBM.
Morning.
Storage brand manager, who tells me that he has watched Star Wars. So very much a galactic theme to this morning's presentation. As we kick off, don't forget to send your questions in around storage, data, the data explosion, what to do about it, how to manage it, all those problems that you're having, and we're going to look at what kinds of solutions exist. So let's get to the nub of it then, Ian. What actually are we talking about, the scale of the problem here, and where's it coming from?
Well, it really is obviously the explosion of data, and obviously we've obviously got a quote here from Eric from Google. I mean, the amount of information being created now is just on an astronomical scale. So, hey, I've got to try and tie it in. So, and it's really because, obviously, as people have started to realise that doing analytics of information helps them grow their business, it helps them get ahead of the competition. They do more of it than everyone else does it. And I think what we're seeing more and more is with some of the online retailers as well, for example, that they're realising that through some of these analytics, then also it can help them with selling more product, for example. So it is just everywhere. And if I take my own kind of personal example, then obviously I now have kind of my own NAS device in my own home, which a few years ago would have been unheard of for most people. Could be for most people today, even, I guess. But it's digital pictures, and all the rest of it. That's a lot as a consumer. But obviously for our businesses, it is just the amount of information being created through analytics, through growing the business. Obviously the digital age has come, and everything is now being stored digitally, not big filing cabinets, and it's how do we consume all of that.
And it's not just big business, is it, Tony?
No, and it's not just the obvious sources of information either. There's a lot of technology now that's generating data that most people never get to see, all the embedded monitoring tools, whether it's from your power systems at home or in the infrastructure that keeps the universe running, at least the universe on this planet running. And there is data beyond the planet's surface. There's quite a bit just spun outside of the solar system for the first time on the old
Voyager. I wonder
Voyager
if you'd bring that up.
Yes, you invited me in, so bound to do that. But there's also the way that people work has changed quite dramatically. So it's not just that we're generating information, we're also much more likely to share it around. Yeah. And that sharing usually doesn't mean keeping one copy that everybody looks at. It means, sending out the PowerPoint file or sending out the pictures to 73 different people and then them modifying them slightly and keeping just different versions of them. So there is really a lot of data coming from a lot of new places, as well as people just behaving differently and generating it automatically more.
So let's have a look at what kinds of problems that causes.
Sure. So, I mean, for the businesses, I think really the big issue is the large companies of yesterday the small companies of yesterday are now kind of the same size as the large ones were not so long ago. So obviously with this data growth, it's meaning they're having to buy more and more infrastructure. Now in the past that was a couple of disks inside a server. It wasn't really a problem until you suddenly had, instead of one server, it was suddenly half a dozen. Then you start thinking of pooling all of that together and maybe having a storage infrastructure, and then suddenly you need more than one of those as well. And of course, so that's got the, depending on scale and size of the company, that's a floor space, it's the power, it's the cooling, and then the manageability of all of that as well. The more of them, that management piece particularly becomes a real issue.
And the management piece is really interesting because in almost every business outside of the really big enterprises where they've got storage specialists, data and storage tends to be looked after by IT generalists, and these days much more by individuals who are not IT trained in any way. Mm-hmm. So the experience of looking after this stuff, and even the visibility of what's out there, is not that great. It's always been storage has been part of something else. Yep. And it's only really been recently that with the use of NAS at home, or indeed in the business, that we've begun to actually recognise just how much data there is out there.
But I mean,
and the cost of looking after
one thing that we were talking about earlier, Tony, was just a general lack of understanding of what to do. For some reason, storage sounds like it should be something very simple, but it's actually quite complex to manage.
And that's really at the heart of the problem. There are a lot of specialised things you need to do with storage, and not just storage, but also storage management. How do you look after data properly? How is it protected appropriately? And they are things that a lot of IT generalists just haven't had the time to sit down and find out about. It's been too busy keeping everything going, as we've talked about on many Regcasts. With the audience out there, they tell us that they're under a lot of stress. And so having the time to sit back, work out, well, how can we do things differently? How can we learn new skills to look after this storage that's exploding is just something that's hard to find time for. And that's sort of replicated by the fact that we ran a server survey with the register audience a couple of years ago, where we asked them what were the biggest pressures that they were seeing or that were changing the way that they managed their server infrastructure and the way that they were trying to implement server virtualization, and surprised us all that the number one answer when it came back was actually it's the growth of storage, it's the growth of data.
And as we're seeing, it's this problem is leading us to be pretty inefficient in the way that we actually manage our data today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we just touched on a few points of, multiple copies of data is one example, but it is also because people have ended up with multiple systems. And even in some of the, slightly more mature customers where they have, networking, storage network infrastructure in place as well. It was supposedly 10 years ago going to be the answer to everybody's problems. It can feel a little bit like it's some expensive plumbing in between some directly connected systems still. And so you can still end up with one system being full, one system being empty, nearly empty, one being half, and not being able to share. And it's how do we get away from that? Because the reality we are seeing from, I think the industry numbers support it, and we're seeing it from the studies IBM are doing with our customers, that utilisation of storage is still in the kind of 30% arena. And as obviously this example shows here, no one would buy another building if they currently had one with 10 stories, only 3 were full. They wouldn't buy another building when they employed new people. But that's actually what people are doing with their storage infrastructure today. And a lot of it is because they've not realised in the past what resource they've really got available.
It comes down to a couple of other things as well, some of which are cultural and some of which are actually financial. We know that in the past it was the technology that basically dictated this limitation on the amount of storage that we could effectively use. You had to pre-allocate storage right at the beginning because actually modifying it later on after implementation was really difficult. So you essentially bought too much because that was the safe thing to do. And it wasn't too expensive. It cost more money, but it was safer to do that than to do nothing. But the whole way that IT is financed has been pretty much in that siloed fashion. So actually building a storage infrastructure that everybody can share in the same way that building a virtualized server infrastructure that everybody can share, actually means you have to change the way IT is financed. You go away from the individual project-based funding to much more infrastructure-based funding, and that causes challenges. We know again from the register audience when we've surveyed everybody out there that they tell us, well, some of the people who have paid for these things don't want anybody else to use their stuff, because they're afraid it might impact the service that they get from the infrastructure.
So storage should be more like banking. So that's
I'm not sure I'd go that far. I really wouldn't want to go there at all.
Well, and speaking of banking, let's have a few words about regulation and how that's having an impact.
Are banks regulated? Okay, right. Yeah, apparently. No, what we've got here is basically a list of some of the pressures that are coming on to people looking after storage and storage management. We've mentioned, the growth in unstructured data, just people doing stuff. We talked about, again, that the lack of specialist storage management skills that IT professionals have, because, again, it's been almost subsumed in part of everything else that they do. But now, with the focus turning to it, got to develop those more and more. But there's these other two places there, one of which is the regulation that you mentioned. There are becoming external pressures on literally making sure that people do keep certain types of data, but equally importantly, making sure that some types of data are removed at certain times. And that's something that's often overlooked. They vary industry by industry. There are a few cross-industry things like how long you have to keep your accounting records for, things like this. But there's a bunch of stuff, specialist for each industry, general, that are putting the pressure on actually making sure that you can show that you're keeping data well. And the last point on here is actually that user expectation that we touched on earlier. Not only are people generating all of this data all the time, but they expect to be able to retrieve it instantly, even if they haven't actually accessed, this picture in the last 10 years. They still want to get it back like that.
So, Ian, how does that reflect your experience working with IBM's customers?
Absolutely, and I think the problem, exactly as he just articulated, is that it's, well, what do I delete? I know there's all these regulations that says I have to keep things, so I'll just keep everything. That's the easy answer, rather than actually analysing it properly, because there's the offset of, in the past, storage technology seemed so cheap, it was twice the size, half the price each year, or almost. Or it's easier just to buy more than spend all the manpower and going through all the users. What do you really need out of all of this? But then, as you've just pointed out, there is this piece of, actually, some of it you're not supposed to be keeping, and I think you're right. A lot of customers have really overlooked that. The deleting is the really scary word for a lot of our customers, so they just don't know how to even start.
Are you telling your customers now to spend less on storage? Are you hitting that?
Certainly, absolutely being far smarter about what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely, because
wasn't
just
so
throwing
much of a trick question.
Certainly, just throwing more and more infrastructure at it clearly is not going to be the answer all the time now. And particularly for some of the larger clients, what we've also been, and I've seen a real increase in this over the last 2 or 3 months, is the issue of actually they're being told they can't have any more energy into the data center. So how do you keep putting more infrastructure in? So there's some real key things I think starting to happen that are really dictating there has to be a smarter way of how do we use what we've got, or how do we use better, get much better utilisation out of what we get in the future. And of course, a lot of our clients have already been through that in the server space. They've done that virtualisation that you mentioned. And I think storage is absolutely that next piece. As you said, it was the kind of just happened to be part of the server for a long time, didn't really think about it. Now it's so huge, and now seeing this horrifically low utilisation, we've got to completely transform it.
Well, let's have a look at just how smart some of those users are being, Tony, in terms of policy.
It does tie in quite closely with the things that Ian's just been talking about. We know, again, the register audience has told us time after time that people, frankly, don't know exactly what storage they have out there. It's a bit like knowing exactly how many PCs you have. No one's really sure. We can make a guess, but the accuracy of the guesses varies enormously. The flip side of that is, as you said, people don't know what they have out there, so how can we actually then decide how we're going to manage it? And as you can see from the chart here, this was taken a couple of years ago. And being a web survey, the people who answer web surveys tend to want to answer the web survey in the first place. We can't force people to answer them. And so the numbers here say that they've actually got genuine policies wrapped around how they manage information is probably a bit higher than in the real world. What we can see, though, is that there's an awful lot of people who will admit we don't have any information policy, or alternatively, the policy is, we keep everything. It's too difficult for us, or we think it's too difficult to do anything else. And that's the bit that really becomes untenable.
Which is not actually necessarily legal, to just keep
absolutely
everything.
No, there are certain instances where you have to remove some things. You just can't keep them. But again, that tends to be overlooked because people think, am I likely to get more problems from deleting things or from keeping them? And at the moment, the balance is if we delete things, we're probably going to get into more trouble if we don't know what we're deleting than if we keep them. So that's a sort of it's almost a subconscious risk assessment rather than any sit down, work it out in a conscious fashion where we really can make valid decisions based on true information levels.
And I think it is the complexity, isn't it? Because the regulations are changing all the time.
Absolutely.
So that they never quite know what is it I need to keep. And it's that constant change in the regulations that I think is just making everyone go, well, for the sake of safety, I will just keep everything. Because they'll probably think there's probably another one next week, so whatever decision I make today will be wrong next week, so why make the decision?
And from the IT manager's perspective, it's a case of we might know that we've got this storage out there, but we're not really sure exactly what that data is. Certainly in terms of what does that mean from the regulatory side, what we have to keep, how well should it be protected? Because again, there's a lack of communication coming back sometimes from the end users about, this is really important, needs to be kept online, needs to be on the best possible protected system or the fastest. No, that's not so important. When was the last time you went out and asked an end user, is this really important data or not? And they said, no, it's not really. Just doesn't happen.
Get rid of it.
It doesn't happen, So forget that. Everybody always thinks that mine's the most important. It has to have the best.
Yeah.
I want to just ask again if anyone's got any questions, but we're starting to get some questions through. One which I would recommend, Ian, that you take a look at on your screen because it's a long one. Right. But I'll pick out some bits of it. But basically, Tom out there, thank you very much for your question. Is saying we are reaching a point where data storage is reaching a maximum. And I think that's going to be quite a familiar picture for a lot of people out there that, a crisis is a problem with no time left to solve it, essentially. It's only when you start reaching a threshold where you no longer can do anything about what you've got that you actually start looking at things you should maybe have looked at a few years before.
I'm not quite sure exactly which way they mean the question, but I think certainly, data is, more information is still certainly being created. But I think certainly the technology, the physical technology, if I can put it that way, is certainly starting to reach some threshold limits. They are struggling on how much more data can you squeeze on a square inch of spinning rust, for example. So I think that is absolutely where the driver is coming from. And obviously it does vary very much by industry, the levels of growth they are actually seeing. And obviously media is an easier one to pick of where they're having huge growth. But we are certainly still seeing across the industries that information growth is still very prevalent, but yet it is the technology that is starting to struggle, which is why we need to do things in a smarter way with that technology.
Mm-hmm. And how much of that, maybe Tony, is that really nothing to do with the technology? Is that are we going to have to face the fact that this is a process issue, that this is a management issue from a personal perspective?
It's always a process and a management issue. The technology is simply the supporting part that lets you do those first two elements. You've got to have the process wrapped around how you manage things. Otherwise, the greatest technology in the world is never going to help you. And again, sorry, audience, I've said that many, many times on very many webinars. But the other thing is that we've reached almost a catastrophic tipping point whereby, we physically, in some instances, can't put in more storage. Or we've simply got too much data to really look after effectively, and things are beginning to go wrong. The risk exposure to the business is becoming so great. And as I said, for the first time almost in its history, the actual cost of storage and a recognition of how much effort goes into looking after this from a people point of view, an IT staff point of view, has become visible. Before, it's always been hidden in everything else. Mm-hmm. Now, on its own, it's been identified as, maybe one of the last really big black holes in IT spend and risk.
And we do have that thing called the global economic meltdown. I don't know if you're seeing that affect people's choices as they're deciding what they do, whether they just simply buy more or just don't buy anything at all. I don't know.
and that is the unfortunate thing. The choice of not buying anything doesn't really seem to be there for them because they can't stop storing information. They're not really going to be able to stop creating information because otherwise they won't be progressing as a business. But obviously, yes, there is the budgets are becoming a little bit more restricted. So how do they continue to do it? And that's again just ties back to how can we do things far smarter, I guess, with what's available. Importantly, kind of coming back to this whole what do we keep? The other issue this is creating is exactly as you sort of alluded to, which is about protecting it all. Everything's important. So if I'm keeping everything, that means I need to back it up as well, because if I've got it now, that means I must need to keep it if a disaster happens in the future. So that the problem is just escalating, and unfortunately meaning that the budget is being taken up on protecting information that they probably don't actually need anymore as well.
Mm-hmm. So. In truth, I suspect that the sort of current economic climate and the economic climate of the last couple of years has probably only accelerated us towards the tipping point by a year or two. I mean, even if there was no pressure on budget, I think that it's just becoming physically impossible to keep on doing things the same way. Mm-hmm. We can't afford enough people to do it. And even if we could afford enough people to manage this storage, the risks inherent in people doing things, in manual processes are just too high, especially with stuff that everybody tells you is really important.
And of course, even finding the right skills in the industry has become a problem as well. So irrespective of the cost of those people, a very important element, but it's can they even find them as well? And you're right, it is the people that in the past were perhaps just managing a Windows server are now being asked to be a storage expert as well. And
Now, Ian, you wouldn't even be here if you didn't think you had at least part of the answer with you. So let's go for the jugular of what is it that people can do about it, and how can IBM help?
Sure. Well, certainly reducing the amount of data that is actually being stored. So obviously information is still being created, we've still got to store it, but if actually we can make it take up less space. So obviously we mentioned about multiple copies, if we can use things like deduplication so that we hold one copy rather than 25 or 50 or however many it is. That is certainly one very important aspect. But that we are seeing typically is being really deployed a lot in kind of the backup type of space, because the kind of the impact of doing the deduplication, and for certainly those applications where we need really high performance to deliver the right service to our customers, that the penalty is too large. But so one of the technologies certainly that we are now starting to really bring into the industry is compression technology. So we've managed to bring a compression technology that, everyone's kind of familiar with compression. We've all been probably familiar with zip files and zipping a file up and watching the computer take its time to do it. And similarly, when we receive one, assuming it gets through our spam filters, trying to uncompress it as well. It's normally deemed as being very time-consuming, so no one's been doing it. But we've now got a technology that can do it truly kind of in line. So it's not a performance overhead. It's not, I can't afford to do it for my data because it's too big an impact. And we're really now talking about having a compression where I'm never going to say anything is absolute, but probably 95% of, maybe slightly higher, of people's data profiles could really get great compression. And of course, we're seeing that anywhere up to about 80%. And for most of our customers, when we look across all of their data types, then we tend to see an average of around 50 to 60% compression. So if we could, we talk about that 30% utilization, even with this technology, if we could suddenly double what we can actually squeeze in, can make a huge difference. And obviously the cost of that technology is certainly going to be a lot less strain on the budget than buying more infrastructure, and of course does get around the issue of floor space, energy consumption, and those sort of aspects as well.
It's interesting how there are few things that are genuinely ever really new and revolutionary. You mentioned zip drives, and if you're old and grey like me, then you remember when it was just physically impossible to store things on floppy disks that you had to port them around. That's where zip really made its name. And so that compression idea is certainly not new. But it's now just the context that instead of just compressing a few things when you want to move them, it's maybe compress everything because we've just genuinely got too much. So it's not a new idea, it's simply a new application of an old idea.
And this is because it's always been possible to compress stuff, but it's put a load on the processor. So where are you actually doing the job, if you like? Where's the compression happening now that isn't putting a load on the processor?
So that actually happens sort of in line. It's actually happening in line. So we actually compress it as it's going to the storage device.
So there's a widget on the wire, as it were.
Yes, a magic widget.
A magic widget. We like magic widgets.
Yes. And we've also just got the sheer horsepower now to do
absolutely.
much more processing.
Yep.
It's the same way that it's much more feasible to do virtualization technology, where you've got that extra layer of processing going on, but you've got the raw horsepower to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the deduplication side of things as well. I mean, what was the challenge? Why didn't we have? It's a big question. I've always wondered. Why didn't we just have less copies before? I mean, why have we suddenly thought of we could take less copies? What happened? What changed?
Originally, we did have fewer copies. What's changed has basically been the way people work. People expect to share now. In the past, you might have shared with one or two people, but a lot of the ideas sharing actually happened on a piece of paper when you printed it out, worked on it, and then one person just kept everything. Before the days of pervasive networking, moving things around wasn't so pervasive. Even when email first came into the business, there were usually quite tight constraints on the size of your mailboxes. So you couldn't send over really big things, that they were just not permitted in the system. So it's just a social acceptance of how things change and the way people genuinely work together that's creating more information as well.
Yeah, and it's the scale of the problem it's created, isn't it? Because you're right, when it was back on sort of paper, we were faxing, or back to the glorious days of sending things in the post even, we physically had something there. I think everyone was far better regimented about, do I need to keep this piece of paper? Do I want to store? Have I got room in my filing cabinet? No, I haven't. Well, actually, if I need it again, I'll ask them to send it to me. Because it became so easy and because storage looked so cheap initially, that's when it suddenly became, well, I'll keep everything, exactly as you said. And so we end up with multiple copies. And I can be guilty of that myself, because, you create, in my example, I create a presentation, and then you create another version which has probably got one slide different, but you don't just add the one slide, you save it as a new file name.
Guilty.
Absolutely. So that, the problem has just got worse.
Okay, just as we move on, thank you for all the questions, which are certainly all coming in now. A question from Martin, which maybe we can pick up as we go along, is, so what is the net new of this whole thing? So why am I here? What are you providing today that you weren't providing yesterday? Or in what shape is it today that it wasn't yesterday that actually can make a difference to me with what I'm doing now?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of this is and we mentioned about manageability as being the issue. So for a lot of these technologies, we've spoken about compression. Compression isn't actually new, it's how we're doing it that's slightly new. And things like tiering, for example, has obviously been talked about for a long time.
Let's get on to that.
Yeah, and so, obviously tiering can help save costs by saying, well, let's not store everything on expensive stuff. Maybe we can store some of it on a slightly cheaper medium. It may have a small penalty in terms of performance, but if the gap isn't too big, but the cost difference is big, we're looking at. But that typically was reserved for the very large customers that had all the staff that could, first of all, decide what should sit where, but then manage it on an ongoing basis. And it's through kind of the automation of all these things that actually we suddenly can make it accessible to far more people. So rather than having to have all the staff, the system can just do it all for you. You give it a very quick bit of guidance, and then it just runs the whole thing for you in the back end. And that was the problem for a long time, was once putting tiers in, how do you then move data between your tiers? Mm-hmm. And that whole data movement piece used to be a big challenge. And things like virtualization have helped alleviate that. And I said automation of things like automated tiering, things like compression, just having simple policies that can allow that to happen as the data is being processed, just relieve all of that pressure off the manageability side, which therefore makes these technologies more accessible to be more efficient.
Mm-hmm. And tiering has been with us since computing began, except in those days it was the difference between disk and tape. So this is just simply adding in extra layers in there. Particularly on the storage side before it gets to tape, and tape is by no means dead. But it is very much that automation. Moving data around used to be a problem, not simply because there weren't enough people to do it, but there were a lot of things hidden in the background, getting LANs connected, and increasingly with virtualization, getting the whole networking side to link the virtual machine to where the data was. And once you start moving around, then you're moving potentially things at both ends of the equation. So it gets very messy very quickly, and that's something the audience has chucked back at us time after time when we've surveyed them, that whole networking and management side in virtual systems and storage systems is difficult, which is why getting the management tools ready to pick up more of that load, so that essentially that the IT pros out there can just make a decision on a policy level and let the machine actually work out the mechanics of it. That eliminates the possibility of just mistyping stuff and getting it wrong and causing service interruptions. That's why now it's much more feasible. It's no one thing that's triggering the why now. It's more a combination of factors, both on the pressure side and on the technology capability side.
And there is an economies of scale element to this as well, of course, because, as we say, going back a few years when it was, well, actually the easiest thing to do is buy 2 more disk drives, and I'll have plenty more for another, they probably thought at the time 3 years, it turned out to be about another 3 months, I suspect. Mm-hmm. But obviously now that things have got so big, suddenly deploying the technologies that allow people to get so much better utilisation start to make far more economic sense, because the example of compression, suddenly getting twice as much effective use out of what you've already got, has a significant cost impact. When you were talking about 1 drive versus 2, obviously the justification for deploying that technology was a lot, the money piece didn't quite stack up.
I've got a specific question on the compression. Might as well ask that, because you just mentioned it, which is what kind of compression rates are you actually seeing?
So it really does vary by data type, obviously. And obviously there are certain data types, like movies and music, which are very compressed, file type, for example, already. So you can't really get much more compression out of those. But things like databases, we see anywhere up to about 85% compression. Log files, quite similar. So there's a broad spectrum in between, but we are, and even sort of the traditional Office files, if I can say that, the Word documents, the Excel spreadsheets, which we have a lot of, and PowerPoint files, we again can see sort of 70-75 compression on those. So it's potentially massive savings, and particularly when we think about a lot of those files, no one knows what they need to keep. If we can certainly make it take up a significantly less space, it's certainly helping to alleviate that significantly.
And those Office files are really important because, again, they're the things that people recognise straight away. And if they haven't got access to it, then they're immediately on the phone. And it's something that, again, because it's something people use every day, it's not really appreciated, the scale of the problem. It's just invisible until it goes wrong and stops working.
Yeah. And very importantly, the piece of that technology, it can do those great levels of compression, as I said, sort of 70% as an average on sort of those Office documents. But from a user experience, it's completely transparent. They don't see it. In fact, they still think their file's the same size. It's just taking up less space.
And sometimes it actually improves the experience because it's a genuinely smaller file to begin with that's stored more effectively. It actually opens quicker.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But there's another question here which I hope makes a good segue as well onto the next slide, which is, can you provide the dedupe and compression on existing storage equipment, is the specific question.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a great question because that is obviously a very important piece, which is not about, I have to start again, I have to go and buy all new infrastructure. And I think we've already discussed, budgets are somewhat under constraint. Absolutely, we can bring compression technologies, deduplication technologies, and indeed the virtualization that we've been speaking about as well. We can bring all of those technologies to existing infrastructure. And by the way, when I say existing, I don't mean it just has to be IBM existing infrastructure. Anybody's pretty much infrastructure we can bring those technologies to. So we can really bring a huge benefit to most customers.
One thing's for sure, there are very, very, very few organisations out there, if any at all, where people can afford to throw away everything they've got now and start again from scratch. Those greenfield sites are, so rare that they're almost, you don't find them once in a blue moon. Maybe it's once in every 20 or 30 blue moons. Yeah,
and I think what we've also seen through this kind of change in economy or downturn in economy has been, we used to see a lot, particularly in kind of the mid-range kind of storage space, that people would refresh that infrastructure every perhaps 3 years. What we've really seen is people are now going, I do need to get far more value out of my existing infrastructure. So we've already seen in that space people keeping them for 4, 5, even sort of 6 years. And that didn't used to happen. And that's the great thing of it. Now we can bring the technologies that allow them perhaps even sweat them even further. Because they can kind of move those down the cycle. The older ones can be the lower tiers, still provide some value.
As long as we can make the management easy enough, I suspect very much now that we have got that separation between the server side and the storage side, that we will be able to use the storage platforms for longer and longer, and potentially some of them until either you get the hard disks crash, or more likely the vendors start putting up the warranty prices for your maintenance contracts.
I was going to come to that.
Yeah, you're right, and that's always the balance. But the maintenance prices probably haven't been changed. We haven't really seen a huge change in hardware maintenance prices over the last few years. They're not particularly going up or anything like that. And again, so if we can deploy technology that say you can get more out of what you've got, suddenly that maintenance cost, in effect, price per terabyte, if you want to look at it that way, actually gets less by having the right technologies and getting value out of it. And I think also very importantly, the piece that we're plugging into this is that rather than storage having to be managed as a separate entity, interfacing that in so that actually those that are familiar with managing a VMware environment, for example, can actually just manage the entire storage infrastructure from their VMware console, not have to actually access the storage system itself. So we're really helping to take all the complexity, well, not all, you can't get rid of all of it, but a massive amount of the complexity out of managing storage.
Before we get on to thing provisioning, because I know you're going to want to talk about that, got a couple of questions around networks, basically. So thank you, Stephen and Ian, but roughly both questions ask, surely if you squeeze everything into smaller spaces, aren't you actually creating a problem with a bottleneck on how you actually access that data? What do you do about the throughput?
In fact, so sort of, it depends which way you want to approach that one, I suppose, because actually what we're seeing is with a lot of these reduction technologies, we're taking stress off of networks, for example. And in fact, some of the customers we've been working on with compression, it's meant they haven't had to upgrade their network infrastructure because we've compressed it, there's less now going through the network. And particularly where they're perhaps replicating to a disaster recovery site, suddenly they don't need as large a bandwidth to get, through to that site because we're transmitting less. So I would actually say there is a certain argument that says eventually you could end up with a situation where you've got so much information. But certainly right now, what we'll actually allow is, even in the network infrastructure, allow people to get more out of the existing network infrastructure, perhaps helping some of our customers delay going up to 10 gig Ethernet and things like this as well, for example.
The big thing that's still going to occur, and it's the same thing that's always happened in IT, is that there might genuinely be bottlenecks because of the architecture or the usage of whatever you're putting in. So with things like desktop virtualization beginning to take off. They could potentially put an I/O stress onto your networks at Monday morning, come into work time. So it's simply a matter of architecting around it. But again, if you are genuinely saving less data to begin with, then you can probably get more people into the same network bottleneck scenario before you have to do something about it.
And of course, sorry, an additional piece within that is the kind of reporting analysis tools that kind of support all these things, of course, have moved on a lot as well, which can really help our customers understand far quicker where is perhaps the next problem going to occur. Is it the network? Is it the storage? Is it the server? Maybe the server, we end up in a situation where, of course, actually it's the server now that is actually the bottleneck rather than the storage network infrastructure itself. But the good thing is now that the tools are there that are much more intuitive to allow, to show people where are the problems if there are any, so they know where to prioritise. And I think in the past it was too easy to go, oh, it's the server. I'll buy a new one with a bigger processor. Oh, that didn't fix the problem. Well, it must be the storage then. And very often the network piece in between has been overlooked because it's been hard to analyse it.
Yep. The whole modelling side of how we can use essentially much more intensely utilised systems is something that's going to become more and more important. As we do push up both the server utilisation rates and the storage utilisation rates, increasingly the network side as well. We've got things like video being used more and more VoIP running over the networks. So all of these are going to put much more stress on those monitoring and management tools. Again, things that the Register audience have told us time after time are areas where it's hard for them to get new spending on unless it's at project initiation time, but where the benefits of actually managing things well and being able to monitor them effectively are really important, and trying to get that message back to the guys controlling the budgets ultimately is the really difficult part in quite many scenarios.
So let's talk briefly about thin provisioning then, just to complete the set.
Yes.
Here's our three beautiful pillars of storage.
Some key technologies, and obviously the great thing with thin provisioning, as we kind of mentioned earlier, I'm not really sure how much I'm going to need, so therefore I'll ask for lots. And of course thin provisioning helps really alleviate that problem. And I guess the scale we've seen in a lot of our customers is that the project manager initially will go, well, I think I might need X amount. To be safe, I'll ask for a little bit more. And then as it goes up the chain, each person says, well, just in case they've misjudged that, I'll add a bit as well. And so we end up with significantly more than is really required. And the thin provisioning really helps to alleviate that, because it says, actually, if you are small, but because initially or even in total, then I'll make sure all you take up on the physical infrastructure is what you're really using, not what you thought you might need and therefore have allocated.
So let me be clear. I mean, the thin provisioning is kind of based on a bit of a fib, isn't it, between the IT department and the business, saying, oh, you've asked for a terabyte. Oh, we'll give you a terabyte. But, we won't actually give you a terabyte. We'll just give you the right to have a terabyte.
Fibs is a harsh word, but masking maybe a little bit closer. Okay. But yes, absolutely. It is absolutely about saying, whatever you've asked for, we can represent it so that you can see and think you've got the space to go into.
Pre-allocation.
Absolutely. It is absolutely over-allocating. And for, I think, a long time, people thought that it was very scary. But we've seen, obviously, in the server, through server virtualization, a lot of our customers are already doing exactly that in the server space, over-allocating processor capability. And because, as we kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of these management tools are there to help our customers see exactly what's going on, it makes it more accessible to start using these things.
But there is one element of thin provisioning that mustn't be overlooked, and that's the fact that when organisations are arranging their budgets to buy the storage, today still it's pretty much that's pre-allocated up front. Whereas with thin provisioning, the idea that you can grow the storage as you move along is really important. But that in turn means that you're still going to hit limits at some stage or another.
Sure.
So you have to have just-in-time budget processes in place to make sure that if you've only allocated a couple of terabytes of storage on day one, that when you get close to using that, you've got the means for the business to provide the funding to create, to purchase, to acquire the extra capacity as you go forward. So it's not a one-off budget anymore. The business, again, needs to reflect that in the processes around how money is allocated to IT. And that's something we haven't seen a lot of change in so far.
No.
To really utilise this stuff well has to come in, but we're not there yet. It's something that needs work. And getting finance guys to change is really difficult.
Yeah. And of course, you get the most benefit when you start consolidating storage infrastructures rather than, as you mentioned earlier, having these separate project-based systems. And of course, there is much better tools and utilities for helping our clients do the chargeback so that they can centralise, but then still allocate how much should be attributed to each project as well. So all of that has helped make the use of these technologies again more accessible.
It's another area where chargeback or blameback or show who's responsible for actually costing the business money has come. We haven't done much of it so far, outside of a few areas. That the mainframe's been really good at showing who's eating resources, but outside of that, we've not really done much. There's always been a degree of pushback, both from the IT department that it was too difficult to do, but also from the users that they didn't really want to have blame allocated, to the people that it really belonged to. Much better to keep it on a per head basis, because then, nobody feels guilty and nobody has to take the blame. The time for that maybe is changing because, the business has got to make decisions about how to use things effectively. And as we build these genuinely more flexible infrastructures, we've got to have, business taking responsibility for things and deciding, well, okay, you are more important than you, so either you pay more or, you get less of the cake to it.
And of course, the other element is obviously there's been an awful lot of acquisition going on in various industries. So the problems kind of get bigger. So that's why they're really now having to look at this, because they've been acquiring infrastructure. So even if they thought they had a great centralised infrastructure originally, through acquisition, suddenly they're back into having multiples and multiple data centres. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of our clients really now realising having 6 data centres isn't really practical. You don't need that many for DR really anymore. So that's obviously on the larger scale. But even on the smaller scale, we can be talking about multiple offices that perhaps have got those servers. Again, if it could be consolidated, and we kind of the term has to come up, use the kind of cloud analogy of being able to access it anywhere and have it protected.
Don't mention the cloud.
Yeah, but that's, I think, that's really where it's going to help a lot of the smaller businesses as well.
And it also brings in the element of, we've got a lot of kit, and it's not all the same kit. It's not all IBM kit. It's not all somebody else's kit. We've usually got a mix. Even small businesses have usually got a mix. Have I got management tools to actually help me administer that stuff easily and simply, so that I don't have to spend too much time doing all the donkey work?
And of course, historically, it restricted some of our customers as well when they thought, well, hang on, if I want to change, it seems like huge risk to move from one vendor to another. I don't like having a mix of vendors because it makes it complex. And that's, again, the good thing. With having technologies, using things like virtualization, it actually helps the customer, and actually, unfortunately for even companies like IBM as well, can give them actually much better buying power, because you can put the value of the infrastructure somewhere else.
Quick specific on thin provisioning. What's it look like to the server? Is it transparent? Is it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you. We said we weren't going to have any.
We weren't going to have yes/no's, but yes, it is.
But yes, yes. And on
that was
that
one
note,
where it is a yes.
On that note, I know people out there are very keen to know that this isn't all just waffle. So perish the thought. Here's maybe the IBM's version of the money slide.
Yes, there is some substance behind all of this. Absolutely, there's the good old bit of infrastructure that we were talking about. So, and I think that's the important thing that we are bringing to market is with many of the efficiencies that we just spoke about. It's whether people do need something new. There are still some customers that do actually say, actually, I've got a greenfield site because I'm going to consolidate data centres and I'm going to put it into a new one. So we can ensure they've got the right building blocks of infrastructure with these efficiencies built in. Or as you can see here as well, we've also got kind of software and application technologies that mean we can deploy that to their existing infrastructure as well, or any combination in between. It's not there is only one answer, or more to the point that we already know the answer to whatever question they're about to ask us.
And earlier we said this isn't just a problem for big business. I mean, is this also a solution, for not big business? Are you able to offer things to medium-sized companies?
Absolutely. And, I think, as we mentioned, that the point is we're bringing these technologies, automating these technologies. They're becoming, integrated into systems. We have, kind of unified systems, of course, that can now provide that very simple management and automation of all these technologies all built in. And the great thing is, kind of at the lower end of the scale, we have a way of bringing in that technology that still does the virtualization. So we even help with the transition of if they want to move away from something, or again, they want to get better utilization out of what they've already got. We can help them with, you can buy something with, with the budget you had for buying some capacity today, but then we can help you significantly improve the utilization of not only what you've just bought, but everything that preceded it as well.
And just for Chris out there, yes, it's in line. Thank you. Okay. It sits between systems. That's what you said before, wasn't it? So, yeah, I think we've acknowledged that question. So let's turn to you, Tony, and think about, okay, let's invest, but, what are the practicalities of actually making some of this stuff happen? It really goes back to the business-oriented questions, doesn't it?
It's back to the business-oriented questions, but also importantly from the people watching us today, it's also down to the level of understanding that exists around storage technologies generally. I mean, the first slide here is actually taken from a survey that we ran in the UK, Germany and France quite recently, looking at the levels of understanding, particularly in smaller and mid-sized businesses. And as you can see from here, apart from backup and recovery, backup to tape, backup to disk, there are lots of areas here where people out there are telling us that these new, more sophisticated storage management solutions are not relevant, or occasionally that there's been a few people tried them with problems, a few more tried them with some success. But there's a huge element of grey on the left-hand side of the chart here, where people are saying, no, it's not relevant to us. That level of understanding just isn't there. And again, when we've surveyed the register audience time after time, we ask about how comfortable are you that the business drivers behind, the technology solutions behind. Things like server virtualization, really up there. People are confident, comfortable that they know all about it, where it fits, where it doesn't fit, how to make it work. But when we then start asking them about storage management, storage virtualization, things like this, the numbers fall quite quickly because, as we said, there's been much less focus and attention paid on it, which sort of takes us into, just what's happening, that people think these solutions are not relevant. Is it genuinely that they just haven't had a chance to look at things? Or is there something more behind it? And as you can see from this chart, it's not simply that people think they're not appropriate to them, that they think that they're just overkill for us, or they're too complicated for us to look after, or possibly even they're just too expensive. There is still this perception that a lot of the solutions we've been talking about here are really only for the big data centres. They're not for mid-sized businesses and smaller businesses. That level of understanding is something that the industry vendors and to a degree the analysts and folks like yourself have really got to try and help people understand that there are more possibilities. Can't help you finding the time to actually find out what ones work for you, but there really are more potential.
And this is this trade-off essentially between, trade-off, I'm not sure that's the right expression, but essentially storage sounds simple, but then the moment that you scratch the surface of storage, you find that it's not. You find it's about indexing, classification, all those
it's very
rather complicated things.
It's very much like rocket science, In theory, it's very simple. You get a couple of components and you burn them, and you get a lot of energy coming out the back that pushes something forward. But the devil is in the detail. And the area that you just mentioned there in terms of, finding out what that data is and categorising it appropriately so that you can take proper actions on it and look after it in the way that it needs to be looked after and that the company's willing to fund. That's the part at the moment that there's still a degree of work, manual effort needed, certainly in terms of getting the political relationships working so that the end users are comfortable in how you're looking after the data and happy to pay for it to be looked after in that way.
Yeah, and I think, exactly the problem of, am I going to get benefit out of this? And I can remember a few years ago talking to a customer who actually was looking to deploy a centralised management system, but actually said after we evaluated, we realised we'd have to hire someone else to actually look after it. And you kind of go, that defeats the object somewhat, doesn't it? But I think that's where the changes are coming because, go back a few years, and we all know in IT things are, are changing at a very rapid rate. By automating an awful lot more, that we're taking that complexity out, not making that actually someone's got to sit there constantly monitoring exactly what's happening, having to do the movements and all the rest of it. Now the whole management piece has become simplified with automated technologies. That's, I think, where hopefully as we move forward we'll see less customers saying, I don't think they're relevant.
That does respond directly to a question from Julius here, which is that manpower is the big bottleneck as far as they're concerned, and manpower to manage multiple platforms is the big bottleneck. So what you're saying is recognising that bottleneck and automation is very much the key.
Well, yeah, it's consolidating the management, using automated technologies to take the stress and the complexity out of deploying efficiency technologies, as it were. But then also, as I said, we're ensuring we can bring the management layer back closer to the server, which is where more people are familiar with managing. So if we can make it look very simple from that perspective, it really alleviates a lot of that.
Over the last 5 years, we've really begun to see a much wider acceptance of automation as a part of daily IT life. 5 years ago, when you come along with an automation tool on management, it was always, I want to press yes and yes and yes before it happens. And to a degree, there was a level of fear out there that it's going to get rid of my job. There's just so much work to be done that you can't manually do it all. Everybody has routine tasks that they repeat time after time after time that just have to be done. Getting those pushed over to an automation system is the way to go.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a good job, isn't it, everybody out there, that the cloud is going to solve all of our problems for us, isn't it? We've got the obligatory cloud slide now, and we're going to speak about it for as quickly as possible and get it out of the way.
It's the fluffy things.
It's the fluffy stuff.
Is that all we need to say on it? I mean, it is. I think there has very much been a danger that it can be implied that cloud is the answer to all the problems, just as storage networking 10, 15 years ago was the answer to all the problems back then.
Sure, it still will be one day.
Absolutely. So, and I think one could argue almost deliberately that cloud is a little bit fluffy at the moment, and people's perception and interpretations of it are wildly different as well. I think what it really is demonstrating is changing expectations of what you can do and how you can actually store information, for example, and having it more accessible. So we mentioned the case of duplication, because people want instant access to information wherever they are in the world. Mm-hmm. Things like cloud, and with the right technologies behind it, can start to deliver that, where wherever you are in the world you can still access it from the same place rather than needing to keep multiple copies. But equally, I think people just need to be slightly cautious of it. Can be misinterpreted sometimes. Some cloud services out there can be viewed as almost a managed service when perhaps they might not be. Some of them are, but and that's the difficulty at the moment. It's not very clearly defined exactly what cloud is supposed to mean, I think.
And to just emphasise that point, you've got internal clouds, where you're really optimising everything, which is really what we've been talking about. If you do everything that we've been talking about earlier, you could say that you've ended up with a virtualised internal cloud. Great, fine, you've got still full control of that. If you're looking at cloud as being something outside the business, then the Register audience has told us time after time that there's a number of factors that come into play there. Some of them technical, a lot of them just down to the practicalities of, can I actually move all of this data quickly enough to the cloud and get it back again if I need it? And then there's the whole, regulatory side. Can I move it somewhere where I'm not sure where it's going to go? Am I moving it to a local managed service provider? Great, I know exactly where it is. Putting it in this fluffy thing with the cloud, one of the big mega hosters, where is it? How do I get it back? Is it being managed properly or not? What are my service level agreements? Are there any service level agreements? Whose contract law applies? Should I encrypt it before? Yeah, it gets messy very quickly. That's why there's a lot of reluctance on there, a lot of which are political and perceptual, some of which are still technical. And there's also the whole economic side. Is it actually genuinely cheaper to move stuff out to the cloud, a lot of data, or to keep it internally? At the moment, the balance is probably, keep it internally is cheaper than sending it out, even with the management costs if you measure them, because you've still got those management costs anyway. Yeah.
And certainly picking up on a question from Adrian here, which is to say, you've kind of half answered, but I'll ask the question anyway, which is, do you see cloud as more of a kind of fallback position rather than a full part of the answer, if you like, or how would you position it?
I think it's potentially part of the answer, and there is no absolute. It's one of those ones that's very easy to answer with. It depends, if I'm honest. But so for some people, for some organisations, it is going to be it could be a great answer. But I think just as we spoke about, it's as long as people understand very clearly what they're going to get from it. And of course, a lot of the problems we're still seeing, in the UK is about the network infrastructure. Is it really there to allow them to, exactly as you said, to move the data? Are they actually going to end up with a worse performance for for their own users by moving information to the cloud if they don't have the right network bandwidth? And that's still coming, I think, in the UK.
And networking's still not pervasive anyway. No. But cloud is simply another option. It's not the answer to life, the universe, and everything, in the words of Douglas Adams. It's just another option to take into account and either use or not use, depending on where it makes sense.
Okay, so moving on and moving towards the end now. So thank you very much for all of your questions, and we'll try to wrap up and answer as many of these questions as possible before we finish. But hopefully some of them will be answered when we hit the question of what to do now. We like to leave you with some very specific things that you can do. And Tony, these have actually come from research, I believe. So
they have indeed, and they're the basics really. They're the things that everybody knows that they should do, but finding the time to do them is the tricky part. So find out what you've got. Before you know what you've got, then it's really hard to work out how to manage it. What data is actually on there? How important is it? How do you need to protect it? That's all the classification side. Is it being protected in the way that it needs to be protected? Is it meeting the business needs? And then from there, you can then start looking at the technology side. What can I do? What could I change? What's the cost impact of making a change? How can I make the business cases? And then try, importantly, to build architectural solutions rather than these silos that we've done in the past. Until you can really get that infrastructure that supports the whole business, you're still basically never going to be able to optimize things as far as you can go. And then, importantly, make sure that the end users understand that it's not something they can throw over the wall to IT. The business has got to be involved in a lot of those decisions on the data classification and how it's looked after. Getting people to take ownership of the data inside the business is important. And basically, it's what we touched on earlier. It's all about management process and having the tools to support that process. Without the process, everything else can get better, but it's never going to be probably good enough.
Yeah, and from our experience with our customers, absolutely on this sort of tack, this is what we're recommending our customers do, because we're finding a lot of them will kind of take the easy option and say, we've done that before. And it's like, well, when did you last do it? And also, we often found that they made decisions based on the restrictions of the infrastructure they had in place.
Absolutely.
I'll fit it over there because that's what I've got, rather than actually what were the service levels you really needed against several sort of performance criteria. And that's the piece that when we delve into the detail with the customer, they go, we perhaps made decisions based on what we had rather than what we really needed.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, sometimes the budget goes to people that get the best performance from that budget, but maybe there were more other areas in the business that might have been able to exploit that for better value to the business. But again, the internal politics got in the way of actually using stuff the way it should be used.
If you were to look at this list specifically from a smaller business perspective, where would you focus your effort? Would it still be in the same order, or?
I personally, I just say work out what the data is and the business needs, and then make sure you've got the management processes wrapped around it and get the technology to support it. Mm-hmm. But again, you've got to know what you've got to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know, Ian, that a lot of storage people like talking in IOPS, which is a great one for
IOPS and megabits per second.
Absolutely.
And things, yes, absolutely.
So all of the stuff that we're talking about here, is it actually going to, it's a bit like walking into the record shop and saying, I'd like to buy a gramophone, isn't it? So are you able to up your IOPS? Are you able to have 2 IOPS where before you only had 1? Or
I must have.
How does it pan out?
So there is huge choice, which can be a positive and a negative. But the point is that we are, again, we have taken the complexity out of that. And in fact, in an awful lot of cases with kind of automated tiering kind of capabilities, we're actually seeing we can help improve service levels for our customers, improve the IOPS and the megabytes per second and things, but actually do it where perhaps, certainly on a spreadsheet, on a piece of paper, from a gut feel, people don't know where do I really need it, and the technologies exist that say, well, it can automatically detect what are the blocks of data that really need that extra level of performance. It can do the auto detection, move them around seamlessly, and as I say, deliver a much better service to the business.
I think that performance is going to move away from being the realms of the really ultra-critical, important business systems into much more generically available systems. Yeah. In the same way that we're moving, higher availability down to ever more or less critical business platforms.
Okay. Yeah. And of course, this becomes critically more important, and we alluded to this earlier about when it used to be kind of disk and tape, and of course then we had optical at some point in the middle, which I know some customers deployed, perhaps not many, and that used to almost be the tiers. But as there is better choice and more cost-efficient choice, then it actually means that when people are doing data analytics, particularly on old historical data, which we're seeing obviously is starting to happen more and more, then the movement of that data can happen seamlessly. So if it's suddenly being analysed an awful lot, let's move it, but actually when we've stopped, let's move it back down to the cheaper storage mediums again. Okay,
a couple of last questions then. What's the IBM compression technology called? That's a question we've got.
Imaginatively, it's called the real-time compression appliance.
Whoa.
It's very, very difficult to remember
Snappy.
When thinking of compression. Absolutely. So RTC, because of course we have acronymed it as obviously we would. So yeah, it is our real-time compression appliance. And And certainly as a technology, our head of Storage Worldwide, Doug Baylog, he actually talked about how we would be deploying that kind of technology into more of our infrastructure as well moving forward. So it's already available as an appliance today, and as I said, we'll be looking to kind of do bigger and greater things with it as well moving forward into next year.
Okay, and I've also got the question here about where can I find further advice or guidance. So thank you very much for that question, Rob. And here's our further advice or guidance slide. And please do click on the links. And if you have any questions, then there's always the comments area on the Reg website. So you can always get in touch with us that way. An archived version of this event will be available on the register in the near future, but it remains for me to say thank you very much for your time, Ian. Thank you, as always, Tony.
Thanks,
and we look forward to having you on the next webcast. Thank you.
Thank you.